Abby.
Hi, John.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Jonathan Manny. I'm one of the co-leaders for Students for Compassionate Living this year, along with Jonas Weaver, who's in the back. And we're just so thankful that all of you are here, and that all of you came out to learn about and talk about some issues around animal welfare. And so I just want to introduce Abby Skeens from the Clapham Group out of Washington, D.C. Abby approached us speaking about her Every Living Thing campaign, looking sort of for a way to spread the word about how Christians should be thinking about animal welfare issues. And so Abby's gonna show a video, and we'll sort of get this discussion started. So thanks so much for coming. Help yourself to drinks and refreshments outside. American troops will be here after the discussion.
Well, thanks everyone. It's so fun to be here. I'm a Calvin alum. I graduated in 2008, so this is actually my first time back on campus since I drove away on graduation day. So this is really fun, almost 10 years later, to be back. So I'm going to show a really short video that sort of, I'm not going to talk about this for a minute, but she gives us just an overview of this campaign, and then I'll sort of introduce this all to it.
They're His creation, and He gave them.
1 second. I'll policy person at a time. Okay, here we go.
He knows when a sparrow falls. I mean, I love that verse. And if He knows when a sparrow falls, well, I think he knows about all the other animals too, as well as us, and it matters to Him. They're His creation, and He gave them to us.
So it all starts right on the grass, with a cow eating grass. She meets a bull, she has a calf, and you know, and the calf is born. And really, this is creation. I mean, that's God, and I feel that. I really feel that, and I really believe that we owe it to our Creator to do the very, very best that we can.
My husband and I got Lily from the animal shelter. I really believe that God calls us to protect and preserve His creation. So it was really important to both of us to get a dog that didn't have a home.
I was thinking about how animals in general really remind us that we're not alone. We think we're alone, and we're not. And all animals, to me, are a reminder, just a little wink. You're not as alone as you think.
You know, the Bible reflects God caring about the animals. And when He makes covenants with humans, He makes covenants with animals. In the beginning, He entrusted human beings to take care of them. Really, our first job description in Genesis was to have dominion, which doesn't mean to dominate. We're to reflect the kind of care towards the animal kingdom that God extends towards us.
I decided that I really wanted to start to shift my operation back to what we would call a more sustainable operation that respects the animal, God's gift of the environment, of our land and our place.
And I don't think that we get to play God. I don't think we get to decide, oh, this living thing doesn't deserve my attention, but that living thing does. It all come from God. It's just natural to take care of something that is so precious.
We don't want to worship the animals. We worship the Creator. But we are the stewards over the animals and stewards over the earth. And if we are in charge of an animal, we owe them good care.
I'm happy to see the way that we can love one of God's creatures in our own home by adopting Lily. And we get to see God's restorative work in taking that life and making it really meaningful and special.
Well, when I eat, I don't eat meat. And Paul, he says in Romans 14 that some people have a conviction against eating meat and some people don't, and we have to just respect each other. But there are principles to live by, and the principle is that we are to care for the earth and the animal kingdom. And to be a disciple is to be one who's disciplined, right? And so to be a disciple of Jesus means that you're willing to give up some conveniences if it will bring your life more in alignment with God's ideal.
There is a rich Christian tradition of concern for God's creatures. From reformers like William Wilberforce, to theologians like C.S. Lewis, to contemporary pastors like Billy Graham. Christians have heeded scriptures such as Job 12 verse 10, when it declares, "For the life of every living thing is in His hand, and the breath of every human being. Evangelical leaders have written a statement on the responsible care for animals. It's a document that outlines our beliefs, understandings, and resolutions to our call from our Creator to responsibly care for animals as informed by Scripture and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. To be a part of this restorative work, we encourage you to review the statement, consider joining other evangelical voices in signing it, and click over to our Resources tab to engage in our year-long Every Living Thing campaign.
Yeah, well, you know, St. Francis said that we tend to treat people the way that we treat animals. In treating animals more respectfully, we will treat people more respectfully.
Join the conversation today to help care for every living thing.
Great. So that gives you a little idea. It gives you a little bit of an idea of an overview of what Every Living Thing is. So just to introduce myself, I'm Abby. I work at the Clapham Group in DC. We're a creative consulting firm, and we were established with the notion in mind that we're sort of this modern day living legacy of the Clapham sect that started during the 18th century in Clapham, England. So probably the most well-known figure of that community was William Wilberforce, who's the great abolitionist who helped abolish this transatlantic slave trade. And Wilberforce actually, as Reese is going to talk about in a few minutes, but he and Reverend Arthur Broome were one of the first members who started the Royal Society Against the Prevention of Cruelty of Animals, along with 22 other folks in a coffee shop in England. So evangelicals have been at the forefront of animal cruelty movement or anti-cruelty movements since the 1800s, and so that's sort of where we find ourselves in this conversation. Hannah More, a philanthropist, a writer, a playwright, a poet, she was also part of this community and took this issue on very deeply. I'm going to read, just to give you a little overview of Hannah and her role in this, because I think it is important. I'm going to read a few passages from Fierce Convictions by Dr. Karen Swallow-Prior. She's a professor at Liberty University. I think she's been here for the Festival of Faith and Writing. And so she has this beautiful chapter on Hannah called Burden for the Beasts, and how Hannah, along with members of the Clapham sect, really took on the issue of animal welfare as part of a bundle of issues that they were working for in terms of social reform, right? So the Clapham sect addressed penal reform, animal cruelty, children's education, education for women and the poor, abolition, of course, debts in society, and this was one of the issues that they addressed and found it to be equally important in terms of moral gravity. So I'm just going to read a little bit from Fierce Convictions. I commend this to you, and if you want me to mail you a copy, I have tons in my office. So the culture into which Moore was born imagined and had imagined for many centuries all creation from top to bottom is bonded together from heaven to earth like the links in a chain. Every category of creation was seen as a link on that great chain of being, as it was called. Human beings were the middle links. Each order of angels ascended up the upward links, and each order of animals, plants, and minerals descended along the lower ones. This hierarchical view extended into the general categories as well. Within the category of human beings, all were hierarchically arranged by class, with royalty, nobility, and commoners, and so on. This image of the great chain of being held a powerful sway over the image by which Moore's society viewed the relationships of human beings and the rest of creation. I think that's a note too, as Wilberforce and the other members of the Clapham sect were sort of wading into these issues, this wasn't something that they were really blind from, right? Today we don't drive out into the street and see animals sort of all over the streets and bustling around, and we aren't confronted with the cruelty in such a visible way as Wilberforce and Moore were. During that time, it was everywhere and it was pervasive, and the primary forms of entertainment were cockfighting and bull baiting and these blood sports, and so it was something that couldn't be hidden, and so I think that is a really interesting point, that was actually a huge part of their society at that time. When Moore's interests and work later shifted in response to her growing Christian conviction, her view toward animal welfare underwent a parallel expansion. Despite the excess of sensibility that concerned Moore, her sensibility helped to foster her growing opposition toward cruelty in all forms, whether that of cruelty, prison, labor conditions, or animal mistreatment. Such cultivation of the moral imagination through art and literature undergirded the efforts of the reformers across a range of concerns. And so that's one of the primary ways that she addressed this was through her art. And efforts by Wilberforce Moore and like-minded advocates against animal cruelty were directly linked to other efforts of social reform. And so that's just the point again, that this was something that was a bundle of issues for them. And as her Christian convictions grew, so did her conviction that benevolence toward animals was part of a holistic Christian view. And her writings came to reflect those evolving views. She and her fellow reformers considered reading in particular as central to moral reform because of the ability of reading to cultivate empathy and deepen the senses, can communicate on the issues of animal welfare. So going off of that and how we bring leaders of faith together to address these issues, that's exactly what we did. Back in 2011, there was a gathering of faith leaders in Washington, D.C., convened by the Faith Outreach Office at the Humane Society. And at that meeting, we were reviewing all of these statements that almost every major tradition, Christian tradition, has on animal welfare, interestingly enough. And there was an obvious gap with evangelicals that there wasn't this document in place. And so Dr. Barrett Duke of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention said it's obvious that we need to develop something to fill this gap. And so after 4 years of drafting and careful reflection, over 40 theologians across the country sort of helping to develop this, including your own Dr. Haltman of the philosophy department, my first year philosophy prof. We launched this statement this week on Wednesday, and we're starting this year-long campaign. And so it's really interesting. We know there's a gap between how Christians feel that they have a responsibility to speak out against animal cruelty and then the actions in the pews or from churches in particular. So in parallel with this statement, we commissioned a survey of 1,000 Protestant pastors by Lifeway Research that was just released. And it was found that nearly 90% of Christians and pastors speaking on behalf of believers feel that they have a responsibility to speak out against these issues, but only 16% actually do something in their churches or even include this in sermons. And so in order to sort of fill that gap, this campaign is really meant to provide resources to you on the website, to provide social channels to talk about these issues, and then to have these kinds of conversations. So with people all across the country, so that we're deeply thinking about, what are small things that we can do to reform our behavior, and then to, I think more broadly, not only to look internally, but then to prick the conscience of society, right, and think about this as a moral issue. And I told Jonathan that I was going to steal the Kuyper quote and quote Kuyper, right? And we all know it very well if you go to Calvin. If every square inch of creation, if Christ has claimed that, then I think, of course, this is included in that. And so how do we live that out as the church? Not only in belief, but in practice. So I would encourage you, take our materials off the table. If you got here first, take a bag. I'm sorry I didn't bring probably enough. It was a bit hard with the flight, but I'll send more, of course, to you all. And go on our website. It's just everylivingthing.com. Follow us on Twitter. And get involved in the conversation. We're posting tons of articles and resources. We're going to start doing a podcast. And every Thursday we're doing something called Embrace Little Things Thursday. And so it's just a chance for us to socially dialogue about something small that we're doing to change. So have a soy pumpkin spice latte instead of a regular one, or do a meatless Monday in your house or something like that. So just small ways that you can get involved. So I'm going to pass it off to Risa. So the Clapham Group has been a consultant for the Humane Society of the United States for almost 10 years. And their Faith Outreach Office has been a great partner for us in this work and providing us resources, because their staff is really working at the intersection of faith and animal welfare. And so Risa's been kind enough to accompany me, and she's going to share a little bit more about what Faith Outreach does.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I have to say I'm very impressed after being in lectures and all week to show up on a Friday night to hear more people speak. So thank you for coming out. So I'm Risa Courier. I'm with the Humane Society of the United States. You guys hear me okay? Yes. But I'm the Strategic Initiatives Manager. So I work in the Faith Outreach Office, and for those of you who aren't familiar with HSUS, that's our acronym, we're the largest animal protection organization in the U.S., and our motto is that we celebrate animals and confront cruelty. So we confront cruelty in all of its forms, and we focus on all animals. So we don't focus just on dogs and cats. We work on transformational change by targeting systemic cruelty. So we work on factory farming issues. Many of you have been following what's happening in Africa since Cecil the lion got killed. We're working on a ban on ivory sales in the U.S. and the wildlife trade. And we work to fight against puppy mills. So those big issues is what we work on. We're also the #1 provider of drug care to animals in America. But that being said, we don't think that, we think rescue is important, but we realize that we can't rescue our way out of this situation. There's so many cruelties confronting us that we have to have a multi-pronged approach to helping animals. So we do a lot of work legislatively, we have a legal team, we work to strengthen the cruelty codes in all states, but we also work on legislation at the federal level as well. So as Abby mentioned, faith has played a tremendous role in the animal protection movement for a very long time. Evangelical Christians were the founders of the first Animal Protection Society, and faith organizations continue to play a really instrumental role in this movement. And one reason for that is that we are seeking to change behavior, and we aren't going to do that just through changing minds. We have to reach people through their hearts, and one way we do that is through faith. So it will be no surprise to you, the Humane Society of the United States, we just celebrated our 60th anniversary, which we're very excited about. And interestingly enough, we were formed and led by clergy for most of our existence. So faith has played a very critical role in the foundation of our organization, and the Faith Outreach Program is a continuation of our commitment to faith. So we engage with the faith community in a couple different ways. This is our multi-faith advisory council, and we rely on our council to not only serve as advisors to us, but they go out into their communities and they are ambassadors for the work that we do in animal protection. This is our Dharmic Council. They are also very critical to our work, and right now they're working on the Humane Cosmetics Act, which is on the federal level. So many of you are familiar with the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si. So this is a bold and uniquely explicit call to protect creation. And it really reflects what I believe is that we are in a sort of Renaissance period when it comes to animal protection. The launch of the evangelical statement on animals also reflects this renewed commitment to examine cruelty to animals in all of its forms. So almost every major religion has some sort of statement on how the responsible treatment of animals. So we have compiled all of these statements, and we have them on our website, and it's also now in book form.
And we'll send these to y'all. You can have make copies of
And this is a wonderful resource, because if you're going to meet with someone that is maybe you have a different faith and you're not familiar with their faith background, or maybe even your own denomination. Like, I'm a Methodist, and I looked in there, and John Mosley said some pretty amazing things about animals. He was also part of the Clapham group, of this original group of individuals that formed the modern animal protection movement. So I think that, you know, if this is something you want to engage with your pastors on or professors, this is a fabulous resource, because we're not asking anyone to embrace something that's new. In fact, this has been part of our faith for a really long time. And so here's the book form, Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com, but we will be glad to send you guys some copies. So we actually have a faith outreach volunteer program. We have 65 volunteers right now, and a lot of them are here in the Midwest. We have some really great volunteers here in Michigan. And these volunteers are critical to our program because they go into their faith communities and they spread the word about animal protection. And so they utilize a couple different resources to do that. So we have Fill the Hole and Community Backyard, which is really fun. I have 2 little children, and you can just do some small things with the little ones at your church to kind of teach them about respect and care for wildlife. And then later this evening, we're going to have a screening of Eating Mercifully, our award-winning documentary about industrial agriculture from a faith perspective. So we also have an ally program and seasonal campaigns. So our ally program is if you don't want the pressure or maybe the engagement of being a volunteer, but you just want to be affiliated with HSUS. So we have forms in the back there if you want to sign up, and we can link you up to all of our resources. And we just had our St. Francis Day in the box for St. Francis Day, which is later this week or next week. And so that is a wonderful little kit we send to churches and congregations to get them going on celebrating St. Francis. So faith and public policy. So I'm just interested, I don't very regularly get the opportunity to engage with college students. So what do you guys think? Do you think that faith should play a role in public policy? For those of you who do you think it's appropriate that your faith should guide your politics? Yes or no? Yes? Yeah. So show of hands. Like, you think that you should vote and you should lobby based on your faith? See, I think that maybe older generations, it's a given. Like, I grew up that you bring your faith into the public square. That's a responsibility. So I grew up in an evangelical church, and I was taught that's what you do. And so I went on later, and I worked for political appointees in George W. Bush's administration. And that was a really transformative administration because they established an office just to engage with faith communities. And President Bush did weekly phone calls with faith leaders. But faith leaders also engage on our issues too. In fact, they play a pivotal role in what we do in protecting animals, both on the state and federal level. So, one way that we really rely on faith leaders is because, we might, those of you who are here, I'm assuming you're here because in some way animals touch you and their plight moves you. And when I see a video or hear about an atrocity, I'm instantly outraged. But I think a lot of people, when Abby was talking about the Clapham evangelicals, we're confronted with misery and cruelty in many forms, including to humans. And how do we balance? Or why should we give consideration to animals? But we know that God created them, He blessed them, He formed covenants with them. Animals are important to God, and they should be important to us. And so sometimes faith leaders can help us create these coalitions of people just based on them explaining this is a more moral issue. It's worthy of your consideration, and it can reach people in ways that maybe us just explaining the cruelty cannot. So here's an example. Dr. Moore, how many of you have heard of Dr. Moore? Okay, a few of you. So he is the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Church. So essentially he has influence over 60 million people that consider themselves Southern Baptists. It's the largest evangelical organization in the country. And we had been working on an animal fighting bill in Tennessee for 8 years, and it was a bill to strengthen the penalties on animal fighting. But it was so entrenched in that culture that the FBI actually had to go and arrest the sheriff's department in one county because they were all involved in cockfighting, and that's how it was just a huge problem. And many legislators were also in some way or another entrenched in this culture. And so we approached Dr. Moore and we said, look, would you be willing to engage on this issue and work with the Tennessee legislature? And he said, no, absolutely. This is just so important. His predecessor, Dr. Land, had referred to cockfighting as a pornography of violence, and he said, would you bring Jesus to an animal fight? And the obvious answer was no. For us, that seems obvious. But so Dr. Moore helped us lobby, and that last session, that bill went from not passing after 8 years to passing by a landslide. And the reason for that was that he made it clear to people that this is a moral issue, and if you vote against this bill, you're voting on the wrong side of the moral issue, and nobody wanted to do that. So faith organizations are also, I'm happy to report, also engaged on protection of farm animals. So this is something that I think is a growing concern. This particular bill, how many of you, do you know about egg-laying hens? Have you guys heard how egg-laying hens are kept, battery hen cages? So there was a bill to improve the living conditions for an egg-laying hen. And you talk to most people, like egg-laying hen, like the most humble, right, of God's creatures. But most hens on a factory farm spend their entire lives in this much space, and they live in this much space, and then they have about 5 to 6 other hens that live in that living quarter. So I mean, if we went out and we got in an elevator and we were crowded in like that, and these animals, they can't stretch their wings, they can't engage in any of the natural pecking, any of the behaviors God gave them to engage in. And so, you know, you can imagine how it would be to live in an elevator. I mean, that's their life. So we were so pleased when the Presbyterian Church joined us in this effort, that they took the time to write this beautiful letter to the United States Congress and said, this is an issue for us. This is absolutely not how God intended these chickens to live. So I will close out. So Emily Dickinson wrote, not knowing when the dawn will come, I open every door. And I think about that quote a lot from that strange woman when we're doing our work. HSUS, we reach out to a lot of folks that many would not consider traditional allies with the animal protection movement. We have an agriculture program where we work with farmers. We have an ag council, including right here in Michigan, with wonderful farmers that are farming in ways your grandparents farmed, in small herds, and animals that are cared for well, and we want to support that, and we want to create more farmers like that, and we want less animals. We don't want We don't want egg-laying hens to spend their life like this. We want them to be out in a pasture doing what hens are supposed to be doing, dust leaving. So in order to get that vision, in order to get to that place, we are knocking on every door. So I hope if you've heard something that is interesting to you, if you want more information, my email is up here, Risa Courier, our courier, HSUS. I would love to hear from you. I would love feedback. This is such a wonderful opportunity for us to engage with you, and we want to learn what issues concern you and how we can be a resource to you. So thank you so much.
All right, Trevor Sutton. As all of you have multiple vocations, I have multiple vocations. Husband, father of a 6-week-old daughter now, or second. So I'm running on coffee and fumes, and so if I do not get a cogent sentence out in the course of this, you will know why. My other vocations, academic. I'm a graduate student at Michigan State University studying writing and rhetoric. My interests, my research interests there are in dialogue, how different competing ideologies and institutions dialogue with one another, and then also how technical writing or expert writing is translated for a lay audience. So how a scientific research project would be translated to an article in Time magazine. What's kept, what's discarded, what's changed, so forth. So my vocation as academic, and I'll be speaking in a sense as academic, as rhetorician. I'm a parish pastor at a Lutheran church in Lansing, and so as a parish pastor of a Lutheran church, that is part of who I am, part of what I do, many hours a week. And I'll be speaking on regards to this statement and how that impacts my vocation as pastor. And then finally, as writer, which feels weird to me. I've been doing this for 7 or 8 years as a professional writer, but I still hear that. I'm like, really? Am I? All right. But as writer and seeing the world and speaking back in a creative way. So I have 4 slides for you. This is one of them. So it won't be long. As looking at this statement, this evangelical statement on animals from a rhetorical standpoint, I'm captivated, and I trust there are so many smart folks working on this that people had this foreknowledge, but I'm coming in at the very end of the conversation looking at it. But in rhetoric, one of my favorite thinkers, he's actually not a rhetorician, his name is Walter Mignolo. He's a colonialist, or he studies colonialism in the Renaissance. But he has a statement, a concept called locus of enunciation, which essentially translates to place of speaking. The place in which a statement arises. And Mignolo advocates that it's helpful for us to see a text, to see an argument, to see a discussion, a dialogue, whatever it is, to see it and to figure out where it came from. Not just where it came from geographically, like this text came out of DC, this text came out of Lansing, this text came out of Grand Rapids. Not just that, but where it came from in society. Did it come from the top, speaking to the bottom? Was it a place of power speaking to a place of subjugation? Was it a place of subjugation speaking out against a place of power? Was it from a group that's classified as other? Was it the group that's in the center? Was it trying to resist the status quo or maintain the status quo? So to evaluate the place of speaking, the power dynamics in a text. Risa mentioned the Pope's encyclical, and a wonderful document, a great document, but a document that is first and foremost directed to the Catholic Church. If you know about Catholic Church polity, the organization of the Catholic Church, it's very hierarchical. It is the Pope to the cardinals, to the diocese, to the parishes. Okay, so an encyclical really comes from the top down, and there's great content in there, no doubt. But this evangelical statement, what I'm interested in is how it actually parallels evangelical polity, evangelical organization, So the document came from a dispersed group of people saying, hey, we should do this. So it wasn't a top-down kind of question, it was really a bottom-up, why don't we gather together and make this a reality. From there, disseminated out for review and so forth. But then the final product, even the final discourse, it says, this is starting the conversation. This is not the final word on an evangelical statement of animals. So it's really interesting to see the place of speaking for the evangelical statement on animals is really bottom up, which is evangelical polity. As a Lutheran, we're not quite evangelical fully. People call us that and we say no, but then we want to be with the evangelicals, we're confused. But it follows our same organization too, and many other Protestant churches. So rhetorically, this statement hits its audience. If its audience is evangelicals, it has done that in a way that is really within the wheelhouse of Protestant churches, within evangelical churches. So wearing my rhetorical hat, this fits in that regard. Locus of enunciation is kind of the takeaway there. Place of action. Another thing that I was really captivated with this statement is how it allows room for people to take action in their own place. So it doesn't resolve. There's, I believe, 4 resolved statements. And they don't nail you down on this is exactly how you take action. Robert Bene is a Christian ethicist out of Roanoke College. He has a concept called straight line thinking. What straight line thinking is to say that a Christian takes a core value, love your neighbor, and then draws a straight line to action, or a straight line to policy, omitting deliberation, omitting other reflection on it, moral reflection on it, philosophical reflection, economic reflection, all these different things. So to say the only way you can love your neighbor is strong government programs. The only way you can love your neighbor is a strong economy. To draw one straight line saying there is one way to adequately love your neighbor, and it is this. Risa asked how many people think their faith should inform their politics, and everyone was looking around like, should I say yes, should I say no? Bene says that if your faith informs your politics in a straight line saying the only way to love your neighbor is that everyone should have a gun in their house, that would be a straight line argument, and that is a flawed argument and not very reflective. This document, what I'm really appreciative of, is that it doesn't commit that kind of fallacy. That it recognizes these core values. That we are made as human creatures, made in the image of God, that we are co-creatures, creatures of the Creator with animals, and that there is godly dominion given to us. That dominion is not licensed to run roughshod over animals, but is to be caretaker as Cain and Abel were to be caretakers of one another. But it doesn't draw that line saying, now this is the only way you can implement that. So for instance, in my home group, part of our congregation, a dear friend of mine, Brittany, is a pharmacology PhD at MSU. She's vegan. She has a deep love and concern for animals. One of her things that she has to do as a researcher is she has to euthanize mice. She has her lab partner do that. The way that she has taken that core Christian value of having godly dominion over animals is to say, I'm not comfortable doing this. I need to find a way that it can be done, that I can go to sleep at night. People have said, Brittany, that's a ridiculous thing. The animals are still dying because you're asking. But she's worked through it, and her place of action wasn't spelled out in this document. The only way that Brittany can do her job is this. But it's provided those core Christian values, but then provided opportunity for here's how you then put that into practice, put that into application. And I see this as a parish pastor all the time, where people come up to me and they ask me, Pastor, what do we believe about gun control? And I tell them, first of all, what do I believe? What do you believe? What does the church believe? And we got to kind of walk through that. But they're asking me to kind of make that connection for them. And I will gladly tell them what Scripture says about loving your neighbor. But I won't make that leap to policy or personal action, because based on our vocations, based on where God has uniquely placed us, we have different calls to action. So speaking as parish pastor, And then finally speaking as Trevor and as writer. So like I said, the thing I like about this document is it doesn't say here's the one and only way that you can then live this out. And I can then place myself in this document, in this statement, and say, you know what, I can see myself here. Not just in the we believe statements, but in the resolve statements. I can see how I would implement this and practice this in my own life. Trying to remember the exact wording on the document. It was the third resolve, and it talks about exercising our rule. And I think what's really neat is I can see how I exercise my godly rule and my life as co-creature amongst other creatures. That's going to be different than each and every one of you. The way that we have done it, unfortunately we moved not that long ago and we can't do it exactly the way we did, but where we used to live, we had so many animals in our backyard. So many animals. And thankfully we have a little daughter to legitimize this, but we started naming the animals. So it happened one night, I was sleeping. My wife is a light sleeper, she woke me up. She said, Trevor, something horrible is happening outside. Went out there and there was a fox and a cat in a standoff. If you've ever heard a fox barking, anyone? It sounds horrible. It sounds like a dog with laryngitis in the Altoid. And we were looking at just in awe and horror of what's going to happen. Is the cat going to win? Is the fox going to win? Do we intervene? Do we not? This is God's creation duking it out. All these different things. But anyway, coming out of that night, my wife named the fox Michael J. Fox. And that became a name in our household, Michael J. Fox. The next day we said, hey, you seen Michael? And people will probably, who's Michael? He's the fox that lives in our backyard. From there we had Tina Turkey, Dilbert the tree frog, and Sandy the sandhill crane. And like I said, this is silliness unless you have a child at home, but we would have done it anyway. But what we found in doing that is we actually took these animals in our backyard and we called them out of the abstract. When I say the abstract, the sandhill crane, deer, frog, fox. We called them out of the abstract and put them into the personal. So it wasn't just a fox, it was Michael J. Fox. It wasn't just a tree frog, it was Dilbert. And we would literally ask, hey, have you seen so-and-so? I saw so-and-so. Kind of excited. That was how we exercised godly dominion. I'm not advocating you should go name animals. But I am saying that this statement, I really appreciate that I can find myself in it. And I can say, hey, this is not so cumbersome, not so specific, not so nailed down in application that, in fact, I can find myself here. So, 3 slides, that's it.
I'm Steve McMullen. I teach economics, and I know some of you because some of you were my students a few years ago. I come here as an economist, which means that usually I'm thinking about policy, but I also have a real strong passion for thinking about theology, especially when it has to do with the way we act in the world. And so it occurs to me that most of you probably haven't had a chance to read this statement prior to coming here today. So you should, but you can do that afterwards. Let me say real briefly some things that recommend it. One is that it points out that Christians have a unique and important voice in terms of care for creation. Which is to say that we as Christians can say some things about why creation is important that non-Christians might have a hard time saying, right? Or that they'd say it differently. And so one of the things that comes out in this document very nicely is that we don't have the luxury of choosing not to care for something, right? It's not always a matter of preference, right? Because we as Christians are servants of God who gets to decide where the value is. Right? So one of the things that's really neat about this statement is that throughout it says animals have value because they are loved by God. Which incidentally is the same thing that Christians say about people, is that people have value because they are loved by God. Right? So we have that kind of theology to draw upon when we're starting, even when we're just sort of taking the first steps toward thinking through these issues. It's a distinctively evangelical statement. You've probably gotten that already. It centers on the person of Jesus Christ as the one who decides where value comes from and who we're going to value and what we're going to value. And it has a high view of Scripture. So it says when we're going to decide sort of the specifics, we should look first to the Bible, right? And so then it works through the Old and the New Testament when thinking about animals. And so what I'd like to do sort of with all of that is maybe talk about two large sort of theological themes that will help us think about animals that sort of come out in this statement. So if you want to sort of have an answer to the question that this meeting is supposed to be about why animal welfare should matter for Christians, think about if these don't resonate with you as a Christian. The first theme is imitation of Christ. We are, as Christians, we are given an exemplar, right? We're given Jesus Christ as the one who is what we are all supposed to aspire to be. And of course, Christ and the Holy Spirit are helping us sort of look and move toward Christ. But that also means that we have an exemplar for what it means to be a king, what it means to be a steward, and thinking back to the language of this statement, what does it mean to rule creation, right? And this is important because when we talk about ruling creation, it's too easy for us as humans who have all sorts of power to think immediately about the things we can do to creation to get what we want. But that's not the way Christ acted, right? He had all the power, and Christ instead chose to use his power to save others. And so when we think about what it means to rule creation, we always have to go to the ideal king that we aspire to, and that's Jesus Christ. And he didn't rule that way. He ruled through self-sacrifice for others. Right? So then our relationship to creation, all of a sudden, when we view it through the lens of Christ's action, means it's one of self-sacrificial service for the good of the other. And all of a sudden, this Genesis statement that seems to give humanity all its power becomes a statement of a job that we have to do. Right, and that's the second big theme, which is this theme that's come up already, and that's the theme of stewardship. Humans were given a particular job, and it's easy for us to think about how that job makes us special. Humans are made in the image of God. If they're made in the image of God, that means that we're special and animals aren't, or something like that. But we're reminded that no, being made in the image of God also means that we have a particular job to do for God. We are his image, his representatives, which means that and the job that he's given us is to care for creation. And that's what comes out in this Genesis narrative. And throughout Scripture is that God is asking us to do something harder. Right? God is asking us to do something important, which is to be his representatives for creation and to communicate to the whole world what it means for God to love it. So, if that's kind of a theology that we can start with, we've got to, though, to do that, we've got to do the hard work of working through Scripture to figure out what this means for who we are, why animals are important. And this statement is a wonderful starting place. We're going to have time for questions. All right, so I'll leave it at that then. That's why Christians should care about the welfare of animals.
Alright, so my name's Jonathan Manny. I'm a student here at Calvin, like many of you. I'm a junior, and I really sort of got interested in these issues. Some of you might know Matt Haltman. He can't be here tonight. He wishes he could, but he's a philosophy professor here. And animal issues are something that he's sort of been interested in for a while. He was challenged by a friend to take these issues seriously and look at the philosophy of the issues. And Matt, after looking at all the philosophy, came to the conclusion that he really had no excuse for living the way that he did, and acting the way that he did towards animals, even if it was an indirect action. So that was sort of his path to the philosophical side of these issues. So I, as a sophomore last year, was in a class with Professor Haltman, and he makes sure to include a section on animals in his intro to philosophy. So I recommend that class to all of you, 151. If you can take it with Matt Haltman, I'd recommend it. But that was really sort of my entry into the whole animal welfare, animal rights conversation. And so I was looking at interims, which some of you might be doing now. The schedule just came out, so that's exciting. And I had a few prioritized. And Matt mentioned that there was one on animal rights, animal welfare, and animal ethics. And it was sort of like, yeah, that might be interesting, but it's not my first choice. Well, it became my first choice when everything else was closed, so I ended up with the animal ethics course. And honestly, it was a life-changing course. And I took it this past January, and ever since I've been thinking about these issues so much differently. So I guess I'll just give a brief overview of what we were encouraged to look at in the course, and sort of how these things became important to me, so that we can help inform how these issues may become more important in your lives as well. So first we looked at hermeneutics, and I'm sure a number of you have heard that word on Calvin. It's a big one. And so really, hermeneutics is looking at issues from the perspective of the other. So there's you, yourself, I, but there's also the other, and in many cases, the other is a group that's persecuted by the one. There's the one and the other. And so in history, we've seen this play out in a number of ways. We've seen it play out through slavery. There were the slaveholders, the one, and the other were the slaves being persecuted. And there's countless examples that have played out in history. And so we were encouraged to look at animals through the same lens, as animals, as creation, as beings and creatures that God has made and God called good. Why are animals worth less to humans? So really looking at the perspective of the other being animals, and the persecution that happens to animals really helped to inform my view and sort of a philosophical view of why these issues matter. And Peter Singer, a big name if you're familiar with the animal rights movement. Peter Singer is a big he's an author on the topic, on numerous topics revolving around animal issues. And he says that all creatures are deserving of compassion. I think we would all agree that all cultures and all people groups are deserving of compassion. And this extends to all different kinds of people. Jesus wouldn't have left out any sort of person in loving them. But also, Jesus wouldn't have left out any creature in loving the creatures. And so it extends beyond just the human barrier. So essentially, Peter Singer calls us to look beyond those that just are like ourselves, and to look past that, and to sympathize and to love the other. And Tom Reagan has this idea. So I wanted to critique the statement. I'm really thankful for the work that's been done on the statement, and the perspective that's shown in it, from what I can tell, is an animal welfare perspective. And so I'll explain that a little bit. Animal welfare is this idea that animals ought to be cared for the entirety of their lives, and ought to be taken care of well. And so what the animal welfare perspective allows is for animals still to be used for food and for leather and for various different industries after their life. So it says animals should be taken care of. We ought to take care of them well while they're living, but after they're dead, we can use them. And that's awesome, and that's really an awesome thing. The part that's difficult for me with the animal welfare perspective is oftentimes the animals, and in almost no cases that I know of, are the animals dying naturally. So it's not like they're living an awesome life, dying naturally, and then people say, well, hey, this is going to go to waste. Let's use their skin to make leather, and let's use the meat to feed people. That never happens. And so what it's become is animals are being used specifically for those purposes. So animals are grown, and their whole lives look like spending time, like for chickens, in a space the size of a sheet of paper, For cows in a gestation crate, that doesn't allow them to move around. They are just horrible conditions, and I would urge you to look at some of these things. Yeah, so during their lives, the welfare perspective calls for them to be treated well. Tom Reagan, who was another big name in these issues, has this idea that animals and humans really are subjects of a life. And so this idea is that humans are deserving of a future. Humans have a future, and humans have a right to look forward to their future. But this also applies, Tom Reagan argues, this also applies to animals. And so the difference between the animal welfare perspective and the animal rights perspective is that animals in the animal welfare perspective, their right to a future is being taken, and that's harmful to them. Even if they've had a life that's been enjoyable, their right to a future and their future has been removed. And I think many of us might agree that if someone took your future, that would be a harm to you. Even though you wouldn't be around to experience it, it'd be a harm to your life and what you deserve as a human being. And so Tom Reagan encourages thinkers on these issues to take it a step further. And I would urge you to take it a step further too. And so to close, I guess I would back up Trevor and everybody who's been saying that it's so important to first look at the issues. And this document does a really awesome job from the Christian perspective of looking at the issues that are at stake. And so I would encourage you all to take a look at this statement. You can read it at everylivingthing.com. But also to take a look at the conditions that animals are being put through, really so that we can have a preference and taste of what's on our plate, or we can have a preference of what we wear. But really, if you take a look, it's so important that we can look at them and then think through these issues. And again, like Professor McMillan said, this document does a really great job of helping us think through those issues so that we can take that action. Yeah, so if anybody has questions, raise your hand. Feel free to speak up, and we'll feel them.
Yeah, I appreciate everything that you all said for being here. From almost everybody, I heard a lot of talk of like duty, or having a job to do, or like taking care of animals as being obedience to a command of God. And my question is, doesn't that still, elevate humans' position in a way that's maybe unhealthy? And are there corners of this conversation that are taking more of an ecosystem approach, saying like, not only do humans have this job to do, but actually humans need animals and the plants that are feeding the animals, and the ecosystem, like humans are members of the ecosystem, like almost like a humbling. Is there a part of animal rights conversations that is leaning that way, and could you point me in that direction at all?
Yeah, just a quick response. I think that the statement definitely isn't motivated from a place of, some folks in this conversation would say that humans and animals are morally equivalent, and so we don't come from that perspective, that there's still this hierarchy in a way that serves the other. But there is a contour to the conversation I think is really important, and that's why I intentionally named it Every Living Thing, right? And that you have this ecosystem, as you beautifully put it, that we're all connected and we all share that same life. And so we need to be respecting and serving the other in this conversation. And there shouldn't be this power struggle. And as much as we have a responsibility or power, and animals are powerless before us, they're deserving of our mercy and compassion. And we should be cognizant of that and how we're engaging in this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I find just in having talked with many, many people about this, that depending on where your background lies, you'll hear a couple different, you'll talk about the issue of human relation to animals. And it ends up being, some folks are on in environmentalism, they call it the biocentric side of all life is equally on the same footing, and there's no hierarchical difference. But then I talk to many, many people, and maybe this is within my institutional circles, but it's sort of a totally warped view of dominion equals, and you had brought up a really helpful point of we can't import our own meaning into what biblical dominion means, and we must actually take that definition of dominion and guardianship, stewardship of creation, and make sure it's a biblical definition. And the one that's, so it's two words that God kind of gives early in Genesis to have rule or dominion, but then also to keep the garden. And to me what's very fascinating, Genesis 2 is work it and keep it. Genesis 4 is the next time that word keep comes up, and that's in relation to Cain and Abel. So it's the sense of which we are supposed to keep animals as we would keep a brother or sister. Which is, so again, it's not eroding that distinction, but it's clearly making a value that, almost in a sense, since it's your duty, it's not raising you up higher, it's sort of, the responsibility is that much greater. I don't know.
Right. I guess my question is like, so you can either fail to perform your duty or you can do it. So my question is like, is there a way to frame this conversation such that people understand that like doing nothing is still doing something and it's actually degrading human health as a whole, right? Like not just degrading animals. Yes. So it's like more of a virtue ethics kind of perspective, I guess.
And I do think, being Lutheran, we are deeply evangelical, and I'd hate for people to walk away saying that this is strictly about our duty to caring for animals. Really, I think the church has a unique spot to say, in our failure to care for animals, God has restored and made all things new in Christ Jesus. That the point of the conversation really ought not to be, we have a job to do and we failed to do it. That's the second aspect. The first thing is, we failed in our job and God did it on our behalf. The second, I mean, that's what separates, I think, the church speaking about this from the rest of the world speaking about this. So, I'm sure I didn't answer your question.
Can I say one little thing? There are lots of different ways to talk about this, and I think we can also, as Christians, talk about God's vision of what peace looks like as something that we can all try to live into, and that's more, that kind of language and those sorts of arguments would be more oriented toward a community of beings that are living in self-service to each other. And I think we Christians have all of those sorts of linguistic tools as well, and that is deeply embedded in Scripture. So I think your point is well taken because it's backed up well in biology and the way things we understand about ecology and these sorts of things. And also these are real biblical concepts. And sometimes it's difficult to get rid of the hierarchy that's in our language without thinking carefully about the things that teach
us. We've talked a lot about engaging with Christians, but how do you, as people of faith and as a leader in the church, how do you engage with non-Christians, especially with the argument of dominion as a negative thing where Christians take advantage of nature and animals in that way? It's like, what's a response to that?
That's a good question. I mean, at the Humane Society, we engage with everybody. So people from all different faith backgrounds, and then people are, declare themselves to be atheists, and it is a challenge. I mean, it's the Bible obviously gives us a framework that's pretty powerful to engage with Christians. So without that, we have to rely on kind of this ethic we have as humans. What is just the right thing to do towards another living, thinking, sensitive creature. And it's more of a rational argument. Is it right, as he mentioned, to take, a gestation crate? Is it right to take a pig who we now know through animal ethology and through, now our understanding of animals has just exploded in the past few years. We've gone from thinking they're just these automatons that just work off of instinct to, wow, they actually do think and they do have emotion and they grieve and they express joy. And so we take an animal like that, a pig, and we put this pig in a gestation crate, and she's re-impregnated, and that's where she lives, and she can't move in that crate, and eventually she'll go mad, and then she'll be slaughtered. So that, I think, if you take faith out of it, I would think anyone would say, yeah, that's not right. That doesn't make sense. It's not rational. It's not reasonable to do that to a living, sensitive, thinking creature for maybe a little bit more profit. So I think that's where, we have a lot of science that backs this up, that these animals are suffering in these conditions, that animals suffer when, through cosmetic testing, they suffer when, right now we're dealing with a lot of issues with, in Africa, we're seeing some of our most treasured species are on the brink of extinction because of the demand for ivory. So it's not, I want my children to see those animals. So even maybe from a selfish perspective, I will do the right thing for animals. So there's so many different ways to reach people, and maybe not through faith, but through so many other channels.
Yeah. What about the like push against faith because the people who are those factory farmers are Christians, and people see that as an example.
And they often use faith language to justify the most harmful practices. Say it's okay because God gave us these animals to eat, so we can do whatever we want to them. It's actually, in the environmental movement and in the animal ethics movement, there's long been sort of a sense that Christianity is on the other side. And that's largely because some people who said we don't have to care about animals, we don't have to care about the environment, have said that as Christians. And so it's kind of our job to take a broader view and say, well, wait a second, that's not what the church has stood for over a long period of time. And it's our responsibility to make sure that the Christians around us are interpreting Scripture well, and that they're doing their theology well. And the more you look into this, the more you see that you can't justify harming other creatures using the Bible, right? It's actually really, really difficult to do. And so the best answer is always, well, actually, there's a whole lot of Christians that would think it this way, and then give them reason. I think. But you're right. That's common.
And that's part of this campaign a bit, is the church calling up the church, right, and saying, no, this is actually what Christians stand for. And even we've been up and running this campaign for like 48 hours, and there's like nearly 1,000 signatures, and that shows like the strength of the body of Christ saying like, no, this is what we really think, about how to handle these issues.
I think it's helping people to think carefully about these issues, not only from a biblical perspective, but also a public policy perspective. So I find that a lot of times people, myself included, that you meet somebody and you take 3 or 4 defining features about them, and then you can extrapolate out and say, well, you vote this way. And so to help people think through that you can be pro-life and pro-animal rights, and that those things are not somehow check one side or check the other side. And I think the church often we struggle with that. I know that a very formative professor of mine that really advocated for me learning this. I know you had a professor here that really helped, and I had one too. And he had people just saying, "You must be liberal." Why? Because you're about this. Really? Very strange. So I think helping people to think through, slow down and think.
So I really love the quote in the beginning by St. Francis, and I was wondering how in your lives you've seen the care of creation translate into caring for other beings. That quote in ways in your life that has manifested itself.
My mother adopted a three-legged dog, and then she started taking that three-legged dog to an amputee support group at a hospital. Which sounds, I told her that sounds like very insensitive. But the dog is a therapy dog, and it was an amputee support group at U of M Hospital. And once people kind of, once it was like, okay, this dog's part of this group now, not because the dog needs me, but my mother's had incredible experiences in taking this dog, Lefty is the dog's name, I can tell you more, taking the dog to the hospital to people that are newly amputated. And there's one guy actually made my mother leave the room and said, "I just want to talk to the dog." And then she came back in and he said, "You know what? If this dog can do it, I can do it." And so just, to me, that's a connection of valuing animals and valuing people.
I grew up with horses, and my horse, she actually passed away from an incurable Coggins disease. And I was maybe about 10. And that was really my first experience with grief, and learning how to grieve over something that I was really close to. I hadn't lost a family member or anything up to that point. And I think encountering grief and really working through that, my parents did a great job of working me through that. And how to then trust again with another animal once that came into my life. And I think that was really formative, and then how I was able to, minister to other, people in my life when I encountered them going through grief at a really young age. That kind of thing.
Well, in human society, we see so often that there are people that have experienced challenge or trauma in their life, and there's just something about a relationship and their connections with animals that, for me, I think they are able to experience the divine in a very unique way, and they're able to experience healing. And we see this so often, with therapy pets, and for me, my personal experience, I was taking some courses at a farm on handling horses through a very natural, non-invasive way. And there was one horse on this farm. It was a 100-acre farm, and she was the woman who owned the farm had taken her as kind of a favor. She had come from a terrible neglect situation. The man that had owned her was very abusive to her. So even Patty, who owned the farm and took care of this animal, wasn't able to get near her. She was very afraid of all humans. She was even very aloof with the other horses, and she kept her distance. And one day, a woman came to Patty's farm that, unbeknownst to Patty, had just extracted herself from a very abusive and violent relationship. And she walked over to the fence where this horse was kept, surrounding the paddock, and the horse came up to her. And Patty said she just about lost it. What is going on here? And the horse allowed the woman to stroke her. And that was just that one-time thing, never again, no one ever, and anyone else. It was very brief, and then the horse went back out to pasture. But I think there is just something that is inexplicable in that when we can have an experience with creation that it helps us with our fellow humans as well.
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned how in a lot of like anti-cruelty movements, they people tend to fall on either the animal welfare or the animal rights side of the debate. And something that I read from my organization called Mercy for Animals, which is fantastic, is they said that there is no right way, there is no humane way to kill someone who doesn't want to die. And that just really struck with me. And so I was thinking, based on that, and knowing what we do know about farm animals, and knowing what we do know about pigs and their intelligence and their capacities as much as, or surpassing even human toddlers, and knowing that they feel pain and often feel grief, how do you, from an evangelical's perspective or from any sort of moral perspective, come on the welfare versus rights debate?
I can answer on behalf of the Humane Society. So, the Humane Society was formed back in the 50s because at that time there was no Humane Slaughter Act. There was no laws protecting animals at that time. Their welfare or their slaughter or their transport, which is an important part. And so HSUS was formed because there needed to be some national voice on animal protection. So then the passage of this Humane Slaughter Act was passed. And you know that what you were saying, it's something that we grapple with within it as an organization. And I think that, and also as a movement. And it's a challenge. There's no doubt. But I think that we have come, as far as like for eating, we've established 3 principles: reduce, refine, replace. So reduce the meat and dairy you consume. Refine it. If you're gonna eat it, go and source it carefully. You can go to a local humane farm or a local farmer who's struggling to do it right, and replace. So, you know, it's so easy. Meatless Monday, there's so many opportunities to just replace, like, try lentils and tacos that are ground beef. I do it all the time. My kids love it. You know, there's just so many different ways to change your diet. I mean, I think that is the world going to be vegan? Probably not. And if, you know, so I think there's a certain segment of our population that is going to respond to that, and then we'll sustain it. So what can we offer? What can we do? We need, I mean, our goal, I think, for all of us is to improve as immediate as we can to stop the suffering as soon as possible. So, you know, with one of our programs is working with farmers that are trying to do things right and keeping them on the American landscape because they're disappearing. They're almost gone. I mean, it is, you know, I come from a family of farmers and my granddad lost his farm because the financing and it's just impossible to compete. If you've got a little flock of chickens, how can you compete with someone that has 1 million chickens warehoused on their property? You just can't. You can't match those prices. So I think it's complicated to answer your question. And the wonderful thing is there's groups that are doing so many different things and working so many different angles, and we all can work together and we all have our little piece that we're focusing on. So that would
And I think it's just about, you know, moving us down the trajectory, right? And as Risa's saying, I mean, you know, in DC we see this all the time. There's huge lobbyist groups. There's huge money behind this, right? And it's so heavily political and bureaucratic, and you're fighting these antiquated systems, right? And so it's how do you become that reasonable, moderate voice that is pricking the conscience, offering reasonable solutions that can be immediately affected into policy, and then that allows us to move down the trajectory and to move to a place that's more at the ideal of what you're talking about, which I think most of us, or all of us, would support. So, and that's much of what this statement is as well. Like, where can we start and then move down the trajectory?
question made me think of the link between taking care of animals, especially in terms of reform in factory farming, and those effects on, like, positive effects on the environment, and then how that goes from animals to environment back to us in the future humans. And I was wondering, do you guys have any, like, if the Every Living Thing campaign makes any ties between environmental activism in whole with the specific care of animals?
Yeah, we haven't yet publicly. I talked to several professors when we were shopping this around for input from professors. They definitely had a bunch of folks who do a lot of writing on the environmental aspects of this, and I hope that they will contribute and write for us. We have an active blog that we're going to be soliciting contributions for, so if any of you want to blog for me, let me know if you want to contribute a blog. But I hope that that connection is made pretty prominently within the context of this, because I think that's a really important part of this. So.
That's actually how I kind of came into the conversation. My 4th year at the seminary, I never made the link between, I loved the outdoors, I loved environmental stewardship, and I loved Jesus, and I never made the link between the two until a professor, Charles Aaron, actually, made that connection for me. And then that's sort of how I came into this conversation. So I think you're right that there is a flow between the three.
Well, I personally could like talk about this till the cows come home. No pun intended, but I mean, I go to a lot of creation care conferences, and you know, in a lot of different denominations see this from everything has to be seen from an environmental justice perspective. Like, what is, if we're going to examine something, we need to know what the consequence is on humans. So, you know, we'll sit and we'll talk about a community that their water is polluted and they're unable to drink it, and it causes community to be sick. And for some reason, it's a challenge to say that why is the water polluted? It's from the industrial farm that's up, you know, upstream, and it's nitrates. And like, what can we do in our personal behavior that would impact the success and, you know, the continuation of that? So I think there obviously is huge link. I mean, it's, the animals are critical, and you see if you, like, I really, for some reason, I love prairie dogs. Like, I just love them. And I live in Colorado, and they are like fat little potatoes, and they make adorable noises, and I try to get as close as I can, and my husband's always worried I'm going to bring one home. And so we have this, you know, we have a prairie dog coalition, and, you know, these little guys, you know, people have just been eradicating them forever, and, you know, as the West expands, and you know, people want to build, and they want to build a freeway through a prairie dog colony, and it's actually really complicated to relocate them, because if you have like Fred and Martha, you can't just relocate like Fred and June. You have to relocate Fred with Martha, because they have really complex social structures and they will fight. And so we are like one of the few organizations that actually does that. But the thing that's so important is people are like, oh, let's relocate, you know, 1,000 prairie dogs, like put them somewhere else. Well, then what happens when you relocate those prairie dogs? Suddenly, you know, foxes are starving, suddenly mountain lions don't have the food, suddenly birds of prey don't have a place, and there's been all these ecological studies that actually improve the landscape. So like farmers, even ranchers are now discovering how critical they are to grasslands. So they're even important to the grazing of cattle. They're so important. And so, you know, it's absolutely true that the hell, like, animals are so part of the environment. They each play a role, and yet we don't understand what their role is yet. And some of these animals we never will, because they're gone. But we have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, kind of taking that question a step further than with the industrialized mistreatment of animals and then the environment, have you also seen any links or partnerships between people who are fighting for the fair treatment of animals, and then also like people who are working against forced labor or human trafficking and other things?
Well, there is, I think that there's people that work in this industrial agriculture model are truly the unseen of society. They're voiceless in many ways, and you know, one thing I think that the Humane Society is one way that we are tackling this, and there's a lot of different groups working on it, but we've worked with I'm trying to think what the United Farm Workers on a couple different issues. You know, they're partnering out with us, for example, in Massachusetts. We're working on a ballot measure there that will end confinement systems on factory farms. So there'll be no battery hen cages, no gestation crates, no bill crates. They'll be on them. And then it will also ban, and this is the probably most important, legislative initiative in factory farms to do in the United States. It will ban the sale of any products from confinement systems in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So the United Farm Workers support this because many individuals suffer in these industrial models, and so these are people that are not trained and they're not paid, and they're interacting in dangerous environments. Whereas when you go to the traditional model with a farmer who is interacting with those animals regularly, engaging with them and caring for them, and it's a smaller herd, it's a totally different system.
I think we see a lot of examples of the opposite of that, like not people working against it, but in it, right? And that there's this like moral degradation of the conscience with folks who are engaged in this activity. So a lot of times you'll see people who are engaged in bestiality are often linked to pedophilia. Domestic violence is linked to cockfighting and dogfighting, and even abuse within the home to children, right? And that was one of the reasons Hannah More was involved in this. You know, back in the late 1800s, she was an educator of women and children, and saw that often the times the children who would come to her school showing signs of abuse, oftentimes when she would visit the home, the father was quite abusive to both the mother and the child. And so those things are necessarily linked. And so I hope that more organizations would expand the work that they're doing on violence against the vulnerable and trafficking, and link the issues, because they necessarily are linked.
I've asked my congregation at times to, before eating a meal, to pray for every person that's helped provide that food. And at first it's like, oh, the farmer and the truck driver. But then you start thinking through it and you realize, well, no, I got it from the store, there's the cashier, there's the person putting the shelf there, or putting the food on the shelf, there's this, there's the worker. I mean, and so to actually think through that chain of connection between our food and the people that touch it.
We have a question in the back. Okay. So, question.
Specifically about the campaign, how does it relate to lower income consumers who aren't like the people living here?
Yeah, so that's going to be a huge part of that. HSU has a lot of great programs and has set a great model for us in engaging with urban communities and lower income communities. And so we're still working that out and how we can particularly be helpful to those communities in ways that churches can link things that they're doing. So the Fill the Bowl project, for example, does a great job with stocking food pantries, also with dog food, and that's a huge help to lower income families. But if there's ways for churches to engage in that, they already have like a community outreach program with food help and food service, how can we also then help caring for the animals of lower income families? So that will be a part of it. If you have ideas.
I kind of meant like the consumption of meat, like how can we tell families who are trying to provide on one income that's minimum wage and their only option is cheap meat?
Well, farmer featured rancher in the video Mike Helcrate. I recently did a panel with him on for snow meat. And I asked him that question. I said, you know, I'm a mother, you know, our family's on a budget, there's other families that are on budgets. You know, what options do we have if someone wanted to choose, you know, this humanely raised, you know, animal to spend his life, you know, out in the open, grass-fed beef? And he said, right now, the cost of my beef is the same as Walmart. Walmart's the lowest price. He's like, right now, I'm matching that. And so, I mean, you know, and that goes back to the meat society, though, again, our reduce. You know, we talk a lot about, you know, I have a recipe book from my grandmother, and, you know, this is a time when, she grew up on a farm. You didn't eat meat every day. It was used to flavor beans and flavor vegetables, and, you know, I mean, she used the bone marrow, and, you know, everything was used. And I think it also goes back to, you know, right now, as the average consumer in America eats more meat than recommended by the American Meat Institute, which is the industry group for the meat people. So, you know, I think that's a whole other conversation.
Part of the problem is that meat it's cheap, but it's not that meat is cheaper than other healthy food. The problem is that too often we don't have healthy options that are also cheap, right? It's not the agricultural markets that's the problem. It's that the food that's being sold in particular locations is the problem. So you can't go into a whole lot of restaurants in this country and have any veggie options that aren't overpriced, right? So really, this isn't about the kind of structural production of meat and vegetables. It's more about the way we're structuring markets for consumers and retail. And that's a whole different, unfortunately, it's part of policy.
It's a social construct.
Yeah.
Historically, meat in America, the industry is subsidized by the U.S. government, so that's why meat is cheaper than broccoli, even though obviously broccoli is better for you. And so as, you know, the big meat industry keeps lobbying U.S. politics, that's how they get their influence.
Yeah. So, food.
Speaking of food.
Yeah. So food is here, but feel free to ask everyone.
Just like broccoli.
So you have your tables.